In synagogues around the world this week, two things are going to be universal. On the one hand, there are going to be armed guards outside every one of those synagogues for fear of anti-Semitism and violence. We saw it in Pittsburgh in a horrific attack that killed people as they prayed, but we're now seeing it around the world, and you're going to have that security, and that's part of what we're talking about here. But inside those synagogues, every single one, they're going to be reading from the Torah. And the Torah portion they'll be reading from is Chayei Sarah. And it's an ironically named section of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, because Chayei Sarah means the life of Sarah. But it starts with the death of Sarah. And why it's interesting in the context of this hearing, upon Sarah, the wife of Abraham, dying, Abraham buys, in the Torah, tells the story of Abraham buying a place to bury his wife. Mr. Nur, you're nodding your head, so I think I can ask you this question. Where is that place?
It's in Hebrew called the Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. And it's indeed, I read the Torah last week in advance of this week during Mincha on Shabbat and saw how lengthy that portion is describing when Abraham purchases that portion of land in Hebron.
There was a deed. That's not what I'm here to go through. My point I want to make is that the Jews have connection to this land. Hebron, for those who aren't aware, is a city in the West Bank. Jews lived in that city from the time of Abraham until 1929. I don't know, does anyone want to answer what happened in 1929, Mr. Chanzer?
A pogrom.
Pogrom. Arabs massacred the Jews of Hebron. Those that weren't killed left. We can talk about all those things. I'm not using it to make one side or the other. My point is that Jews have lived in the land of Israel for 3,000 years. And I think that's an important thing to note. These are not colonialists who came from Europe. In fact, today, many of the Jews, the majority of Jews who live in Israel, can trace their roots not to Europe, but to countries like Libya and Iraq, Yemen, other places. But they have a connection that dates back 3,000 years. I could go through the history, talk 1917. If I say that, we're talking about the Balfour Declaration. I can talk about 1947, and why don't I pause there for a second? Because in November 1947, Mr. Lincoln worked at the UN. What happened in November 1947?
General Assembly passed Resolution 181.
Which General Assembly?
The UN General Assembly.
The United Nations General Assembly, partitioning the land for a Jewish state and an Arab state. And what happened was the Jews of the time, though that state did not include Jerusalem, did not include Hebron, the Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no. So jump ahead a few months, May 15th, 1948, Jews declared their state when the British left and turned over the mandate. That is the state of Israel. Palestinians who were offered a state instead declared war. There's a pattern here that I'm going to get to in a second. The war that ensued, that proceeded over the years 1947 to 1949, defined what we consider the borders of Israel today, an armistice line. In 1956, there was another war. Israel occupied territory and returned that territory. In 1967, importantly, there was another war between Israel, Egypt, Syria. Israelis said to King Hussein of Jordan, please don't attack. If you don't attack us, we won't attack you. But King Hussein felt the pressure from the Arab world and attacked. The outcome of that was Israel control over the West Bank and Gaza. It's important to get us to where we are today. But there was a conference of the Arab League in Khartoum, famous for 3 responses. Mr. Shanza, you're shaking your head, so I'll turn it to you. What were the 3 responses?
They were the 3 no's: no recognition, no diplomacy, no peace.
Israel offered to return the West Bank and Gaza, and the Arabs said no. Not once, but 3 times. I remember very well when Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem, made peace with Israel, a peace that stands today. I remember September of 1993 when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. A year later, Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan. As my colleague talked about, we had the Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords, which for the first time, and I've been talking about this a lot, and these aren't my words, the words of Tal Becker, one of the negotiators, said the Abraham Accords recognize that both Israelis, or both Jews and Arabs, belong to the same land. Jews going back thousands of years, Arabs going back thousands of years. They belong to this land. And what the Abraham Accords recognize is that by embracing each other, by recognizing the humanity and the connection that both have to the same place, both can elevate the place and their peoples. And that's what the Abraham Accords were about. And that's what was happening as Israel was making progress with Saudi Arabia. And there were certain groups and states that said, no, we can't do this, namely Iran and its proxies. The attack on October 7th, the heinous attack on October 7th, had as much to do about scuttling the progress being made with Saudi Arabia as anything else. And that's why it's so depressing to me that the UN has been virtually absent in its role. And Mr. Lincoln, you've talked about this. The UN could be doing so much, but it has failed to step up at a time of great need.